Throughout history, there are a small number of men who ruled over England, and they had very differing reigns, but most expressed their brutality and will over their people. The most infamous king of all, Henry VIII, despite the chaos and the roughly 70,000 executions, did die a very peaceful death, but in the years and centuries after the Tudor period, his burial vault inside of Windsor was opened a number of times. Lying next to Henry VIII still today, inside of this vault, is one of the most notorious kings, Charles I, a man who lost his head following the English Civil War, as he was executed for treason against his own people. Charles's coffin was opened, and his head was found to have fallen from his body after it was allegedly reattached after his execution. But there were many other English kings who had their coffins and burial vaults broken into in the years following their deaths, and some were subjected to shocking treatment. In this documentary we look at opening the coffins of the kings of England, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks, was the eldest son of King Henry III, and he would be married to Eleanor of Castile. He would even, as a prince, attack some of his subjects, and he would make a number of enemies. Edward was a skilled commander, and he would as a prince take control of the government, as his father allowed him to do so, but following his father's death he became the king. He was crowned on the 19th of August 1274 inside of Westminster Abbey. He had been an arrogant, lawless and violent prince, but he had a lot to prove to his subjects. But he was a man who was incredibly loyal to his family and friends, and he was a courageous and brilliant military leader. Edward was also described as handsome, powerful and tough, and if you would have imagined an ideal medieval king, then you'd probably be thinking of Edward I. He channeled his anger and became a more patient ruler, and he valued his parliament and used these to consolidate his power. But Edward would be best known for his conquests, and he destroyed the autonomous Principality of Wales, and Edward would invade Wales and blockade the leaders and force them into submission. He used sieges and starvation to do this, and English rule would be established, but when the Welsh rebelled, the uprisings would be ruthlessly crushed by Edward's army. For over 100 years, relations between the Scots and the English were okay, and the border region was rather peaceful. However, Edward stirred up hatred and launched a number of savage campaigns against the Scots, and he wanted to seize power in the country, and wanted to establish the land as a vassal state, answerable to the English crown. He even placed a puppet king in charge of Scotland, but Edward would invade and conquer, and he removed the coronation stone of Scone from the land, and this went to Westminster Abbey. He would face defeat against the Scots and against William Wallace, but he would smash through Wallace eventually, and would sentence him to be hanged, drawn and quartered. But around 1306, Edward I was clearly ill, and his royal court spent a lot of money on medicines from all around Europe, and they even imported leather leggings to keep off issues with his legs. Edward's legs were treated, and the king was also placed in a neck brace at times, and he suffered from pain in his joints. Edward took herbal baths and drank other medicines, and his health fluctuated and went up and down in his final years. But when he was travelling to Scotland for yet another campaign, he was taken very ill. He was determined to finish the job against the Scots. On the 6th of July 1307, Edward and his army were resting at Berg by Sands, on the English side of the northern border, and the king was resting in his tent. But the following day in the morning, his servants entered the tent, and they saw the king, and they could not get him from his bed, and when they lifted Edward's body, he was limp and lifeless, and it was clear he was dead. He had died in the night, and there were many stories which emerged about his remains. One said that his heart was told to be carried to the Holy Land, along with crusaders to fight there, and another said he wanted his bones to be taken as relics on future expeditions against the Scots. Edward I's body was sent south, and it arrived at Waltham Abbey in Essex, and he was laid in state. Vigils and prayers were held for Edward I's soul, and by September 1307, Edward I's funeral was being prepared, and around mid-October the king's body was moved from Waltham Abbey to the Monastery of the Holy Trinity, and to other places, before it eventually got to St Paul's Cathedral. On the 26th of October, the king's body arrived at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was rather solemn, and the king was buried inside of his coffin, which was lead-lined, wearing his coronation robes, and this included a red silk tunic and a cloth of gold lower garments. The king in his coffin was buried with a crown on his head, and in his hands were sceptres of royal office. Edward I was then buried inside of a plain black Purbeck marble tomb. There wasn't an ornate effigy on top of it, and his tomb is rather interesting, as it is not the most lavish compared to others inside of Westminster Abbey, despite the importance of this specific king. There were many rumours about the king's coffin, and also his tomb, and this included that he may have intended to have had this as a temporary burial site, as the king wanted his body to be boiled down and then the bones being taken on crusade, as mentioned earlier. But the tomb encapsulated Edward's personality. His coffin and tomb would be opened a number of times though throughout the century, and what those people who opened the remains of Edward Longshanks up found was remarkable. The first recorded time in which a king's coffin was broken into relates to the 14th century, and around 70 years following Edward I's death. In the close roll, or the scrolls regarding the accounts of King Richard II's kingship, there was an entry recorded that said, "To the treasurer and chamberlains, order of the king's money to renew the wax about the body of King Edward I, buried in the church of St. Peter, Westminster, as used hereto to be done." With this it's clear that the body of Edward I was being rewrapped in cerecloth, the heavy wax cloth that was wrapped around a body to preserve it. This means that for this to happen, either the king's coffin was opened, and then his body was removed, and then the wax was placed all over the remains and the cerecloth that existed, making the cloth even heavier. Or another possibility is that the king's remains were unwrapped from the cerecloth, and then the new wax was placed upon the body, and then rewrapped, meaning Edward I's corpse may have been exposed to the elements. However, yet again, Edward I's corpse would be disturbed and his coffin was opened in 1774, over 4 centuries since he had died. What those who opened the body, the Society of Antiquaries in London, discovered was incredible. They found that the body had been well preserved, despite being interred 467 years ago. This meant that the cerecloth and wax had done a remarkable job. It was said when Edward I's coffin was opened that the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard, and the sinking or dip between the chin and the underlip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short, as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on that part of the bridge of the nose, which separates the orbits of the eyes, and some globular substance, possibly fleshy part, of the eyeballs was movable in their sockets under the envelope. It was said, on lifting up the lid of the tomb, the royal body was found wrapped in a strong and thick linen cloth, waxed on the inside. The head and face were covered with a sudarium, or a face cloth of crimson sarcenet wrapped to 3 folds, conformable to a napkin used by our Saviour in his way to crucifixion. On flinging open the external mantle, the corpse was discovered in all the ensigns of majesty richly habited. The body was wrapped in a fine linen cerecloth, close fitted to every part of the body, even to the very fingers and face. The writs ordering the renewal of the waxen covering of the body of King Edward I, being extant, gave rise to this search. Over the cerecloth was a tunic of red silk damask, above that a stole of thick white tissue crossed the breast, and on this, at 6 inches distant from each other, quatrefoils of filigree, work of gilt metal set, with stones imitating rubies, sapphires, amethysts, and the intervals between quatrefoils on the stole powdered with minute white beads, tacked down in the most elegant embroidery, in form not unlike what is called the true lover's knot. It was also said of the king's gown that, above these habits were the royal mantle of crimson, rich crimson satin, fastened on the left shoulder with a magnificent fibula of gilt metal richly chased, and ornamented with 4 pieces of red and 4 pieces of blue transparent paste, and 24 more pearls. The corpse from the waist downwards was covered in a rich cloth of figured gold, which fell down to the feet and was tucked beneath them. On the back of each hand was a quatrefoil, like those on the stole. In the king's right hand was a sceptre with a cross of copper gilt, and of elegant workmanship, reaching to the right shoulder. In the left hand was a rod and dove, which passed over the shoulder and reached to the ear. The dove stood on a ball placed on 3 ranges of oak leaves of enamelled green. The dove was of white enamel. On the head was a crown, chased with trefoils made of gilt metal. The head itself was lodged in the cavity of the stone coffin, always observable in those receptacles of the dead. The corpse was dressed in conformity with ancient usage, even as early as the time of the Saxon Sabert. They also remarked that the tomb was very plain and had been well preserved in the northwestern corner of the chapel. However, King Edward's coffin contained the remains of the king in a very good state, and those who broke into the tomb and coffin were amazed by the king's clothes and also the grave goods and regalia he was buried with. They also measured the king's height and determined he was 6'2", which was very large for a medieval man. But the discovery and opening of the coffin of Edward I over 4 centuries after his death was incredible and also shocking, and to disturb his remains 400 years later just to measure his height is rather strange. Henry V came onto the throne following the death of Henry IV, his father, on the 21st of March 1413. His genius was mostly consolidated with the planning and carrying out of campaigns the English army would embark on in France. He was known for being a brilliant commander, and he would spectacularly win a number of early battles during the 100 Years' War. His work would later be undone in the following years after his death. He was a ruthless and cruel man, but was also a man of his faith, and on his deathbed he would express his wishes that he might live longer to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in a final crusade. Henry V, however, died on the 31st of August 1422 at the Château de Vincennes. It was believed he contracted dysentery in the period following a siege, but the symptoms of the disease hit the English king rather quickly. He was healthy following the siege, but then was stricken down very suddenly. Historians have also stated that he may have contracted smallpox or even leprosy. His health was not the greatest. In the summer of 1422 it was very hot in France, and Henry was riding around in his full armour, and this was not the best idea, and he was hit with a severe fever and possibly heat stroke. But he would not recover from his final bout of illness. For a few weeks he had to be carried around, and he decided to try and get to Paris. He tried to mount his horse and could not do this, and he was then taken back to Vincennes before he died weeks later. Henry V was just 35 years old when he died, and he had been the English king for just 9 years. This is a very short amount of time considering his legacy, and he would leave behind his wife Catherine of Valois, who would give birth to the successor Henry VI, and Henry V would never meet his son, who would take the throne after him. Henry V's brother brought his body back to England, after it rested at a time inside of Rouen Cathedral. A huge procession accompanied the cortege from Dover to St Paul's Cathedral, and on top of the coffin was a lifelike funeral effigy. He was brought to Westminster Abbey on the 7th of November 1422 for his burial. His funeral was magnificent, and horses took the funeral cortege and chariot into the abbey and into the nave. Henry V had stated that following his death, the Chantry Chapel should be created over his body. Henry V's tomb is one which is rather lavish, and around it the inscription on the platform states, "Henry V, Hammer of the Gauls, lies here. Henry was put in the urn 1422. Virtue conquers all. The fair Catherine joined her husband 1437. Flee idleness." The effigy on the tomb was made from silver, and there are other symbols including lions at his feet on the tomb. However, many of the items relating to his funeral, including a shield and helmet used in the procession, have remained and do exist inside of the abbey. However, in 1953, a shocking discovery was made inside of Henry V's tomb. His coffin had been sealed long before his funeral, meaning that this lead-lined box did its best to preserve Henry V. But the decision to open his tomb was then made, and the reasons behind this are not the clearest. The tomb of Henry did have some work done to it in the years after, but when investigators opened the tomb of the king, they found the body of another man, and specifically they found that Henry V shared a grave with a man named Richard Courtenay. Courtenay was a close friend of Henry V before and after he came onto the throne, and he was made the treasurer of the royal household. He would embark on a number of diplomatic errands to France, and he was a trusted advisor to the king, but Courtenay died around September 1415. But when those people opened the tomb of Henry V, the last thing they expected to find was the body of another man, and some have questioned whether this meant that Henry V and Richard Courtenay were actually lovers. But looking at this logistically, Courtenay died 7 years before Henry V, and this meant that he would have been buried elsewhere and dug up, to then be interred inside of the royal tomb with Henry V when he died. But why would this happen? Why did this take place? It means the king's tomb was opened to place Courtenay inside of it. This still remains a mystery to this day, and the reasons for this are not clear, and what makes it even stranger is the fact that Henry's wife, Catherine of Valois, would remain unburied for over 400 years herself. There were no mentions in Henry's last will that he wanted to be buried with his friend, and there were no instructions given as to how he should be specifically buried or whether his wife should be buried even with him. But this is one of English history's mysteries. Why was Henry V buried with another man? And how did people for over 500 years not know about this? Still to this day this is questionable, and there are little explanations in the history books about this, leading people to make their own minds up. But Henry V is remembered for being a brilliant king, and a man who would have some of the most stunning victories for the English army in France during the 100 Years' War. On the 28th of January 1547, Henry VIII died, and following this his body was washed, and he was then embalmed in a number of spices and materials, and it's believed that his heart and entrails were then removed. Where these are today are rather debated, and there is still some belief that the notorious Tudor monarch's heart is actually held within the Palace of Whitehall or the Houses of Parliament today. His coffin would then lay in state inside of the presence chamber of Whitehall Palace, and it would be surrounded by burning tapers, and it was also then moved to Windsor Castle and specifically to St George's Chapel. Henry VIII had specified in his will and to his servants and family that he wished to be buried alongside his third wife Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour would give the king his greatest wish in the form of a male successor and a son who would go on to be King Edward VI. But Jane Seymour, within weeks of giving birth to the heir, was very sick, and she would never make it out of Hampton Court Palace, where she gave birth, and this greatly upset the king. Many have considered that if Jane Seymour would not have tragically died, then Henry VIII would not have married 6 times, and he would have settled with Jane, raising his son for kingship. But this was obviously not the case, and Jane, following her death, was embalmed, herself, and her heart and insides were removed. These organs were buried inside the chapel within Hampton Court Palace, under the altar, but her body was then taken to Windsor Castle and St George's Chapel, and it would be buried in a vault underneath the choir in the Royal Vault. This was the only place for Jane, as she would be initially buried here all alone. But Henry VIII stipulated that he wanted to be buried with Jane Seymour, and he planned for a huge tomb to be made for them together. The king's tomb had been planned for decades before his death, and he wanted a huge ornamental monument which would eclipse the grandeur of his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's tomb. This tomb would have been the largest ever created, and it would have seen Henry and Jane interred inside of it, most probably within Westminster Abbey. He planned to use marble and black touchstone in the same style of his parents' tomb, but he wanted it to be around 25% bigger, and Italian sculptors would get on to work with this, and Henry VIII would argue with them about the design and plans during his reign. But Henry would then give more money to others to create the monument, but the king's tomb would never be finished, and it would have been an ornate one, with marble pillars, gilded angels, and life-size effigies of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. But as mentioned, this was never finished, and the king's dreams of being buried in a huge memorial would be over, and his children would refuse to continue the work as it was too expensive. The coffin of Henry VIII following his death was then taken on procession from Whitehall Palace to Windsor Castle and then to St George's Chapel. The procession was colossal and was 4 miles long, and a hearse carried the huge coffin of the king. This was pulled by horses draped in black cloth. Also on the hearse was a wax-like effigy of the king, covered in jewels and ornaments of royalty, but to many who saw the procession, this was the first time they had seen an image of their king. The funeral procession moved towards Syon Abbey, and whilst here it took a break for the evening, and then it was rumoured that the king's body may have exploded and splintered part of the coffin as gases escaped the body, of the deceased monarch on his final journey, and there are even rumours that dogs licked at the dripping remains of the king. But then the journey would continue on to the burial site, and the coffin did get there, and it was carried into the church by 16-strong yeomen of the guard. It was then carried into the church for the funeral service, and it would be lowered into the vault, where still to this day the coffin of Henry VIII is laid to rest. However, despite the king's coffin being placed in the vault would be disturbed a number of times throughout the years. This was not a place that Henry VIII would have liked to have been buried for all time either, as the king, who liked the lavish things in life, is still buried today under a rather modest marble slab that states, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII 1537, King Henry VIII 1547, King Charles I 1648, and an infant child of Queen Anne." This memorial was placed here by the command of King William IV 1837. But with this we must talk about the breaking into the coffin and the vault of King Henry VIII. The king would never have believed that the future kings would be buried alongside him, and because of this, the vault would be opened a number of times throughout the centuries to accommodate the other burials. The most significant person buried in the same vault is Charles I, and Charles was of course the executed King of England who was a Stuart. Henry VIII had during his reign issued instructions to ban the Stuarts of Scotland from ever taking the throne of England, so the fact he is buried literally next to a Stuart king would be a form of disgrace to the Tudor monarch. Charles I would lose the English Civil War, and he lost his head outside of Whitehall, the same place where Henry VIII died inside of. But to get Charles I's body into the vault, Henry VIII's coffin was moved and shifted, and there may have been some damage with this. Charles was interred next to Henry VIII to make sure that the enemies of Parliament following the Civil War would not be able to get their hands on the king's body and remains. It was deemed as a safer place to bury him. But the vault of Henry VIII was now populated with the remains of one of his greatest enemies' descendants, and a disgraced king. But the vault would be opened again to accommodate another Stuart child, a member of the Stuart royal family. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, suffered a lot regarding childbirth, and she had one of her children interred in the same vault as Henry VIII, Jane Seymour and Charles I. With this, the vault was disturbed again, and the small coffin was lowered and placed into the vault. However, this was not the end of the breaking into the royal vault. In the following centuries, it was believed that the coffin and remains of King Henry VIII had actually been lost to time, but in 1813, building work was being carried out inside of St George's Chapel, and specifically inside of the royal vault. The builders would break into the vault containing the remains of Henry VIII, and then the decision would later be made to open the coffin of King Charles I, and the Prince Regent was even there to oversee this. But what was found in the vault was a number of relics of King Charles I, but there were observations made that Henry VIII's coffin was in somewhat of a sorry state. At this time it had been buried almost 300 years inside of the vault. It was noticed that Jane Seymour's coffin seemed okay, but Henry's coffin was broken. The trestle which had been supported the coffin had collapsed and broken, and this was probably done when Charles I's coffin was squeezed into the small space. It was also said that there may have been pressure created from within the coffin, from Henry's body, that splintered the wood, but the coffin of the Tudor monarch had allegedly then split open. There is no record of any exhumation work of Henry VIII's remains being placed in a different coffin, meaning his remains may have been exposed to the elements and may still be to this day. But Henry VIII would be one of the most barbaric and horrific kings that England ever had, but he was buried in a place where he never wanted to be interred forever. But 500 years later, the king is still there, and the plans for his huge marble tomb in effigy would never be carried out and completed. However, Henry VIII is the most famous king that England has ever had, and surely his legacy deserves a tomb and monument outlining this, despite his brutality, especially as next to him in the choir of St George's Chapel are huge tombs for medieval kings, who did not have as much of an impact on history as King Henry VIII did. At the age of just 9, Edward VI became the King of England, following the death of his father Henry VIII. He was crowned as the king inside of Westminster Abbey, and to help rule for him as he was a child, a regency council was set up to help him govern. The man who headed this was Edward Seymour, who was appointed the Lord Protector, and he was also the uncle of the king. But Edward was not considered to have been a sickly child to begin with, but throughout his short reign he did fall ill a number of times. In the year 1550, he was hit by a severe illness, and some of the royal doctors and physicians believed that Edward would die from this. However, there was a worry as to who would become the next king or queen if he did die. Edward VI did survive, but further illnesses struck years later. The king was known to have contracted smallpox in his early life, and also measles, and it was true that the king could rally and recover with strength. However, he also suffered with his hearing, and was known to have been slightly deaf, and he was also given glasses to wear. But in December 1552, there would be a severe bout of illness which hit the king, and this would be his final illness. Edward VI, by all accounts, had tuberculosis, and his immune system was failing. It continued for weeks and months, and on the 15th of February 1553, the king was suffering with a cold, which gave him a fever, and Mary, his eldest sister, and the future queen, would come to see him. But he could not get out of bed, and he was also suffering with a very bad cough, and some inside the royal court believed that the king could have been subject to a possible assassination plot or a poisoning plot. But Edward VI had many terrible symptoms, and these were very serious, and were leading the king to waste away. Some of the greatest doctors across the land tried their best to treat him, including one woman who was a faith healer, and she was allowed to see the king, and she gave him a remedy or a poison that led to the king's limbs to swell up, and he was almost killed with this treatment. In the middle of March 1553, the king was getting more seriously ill, and the following month he did recover slightly, and was seen by some walking inside of a local park, but he was then well enough to be moved to Greenwich Palace to recover and get better. But this would never happen, and Greenwich Palace would be the place where the king died. Edward was seen as getting sicker and sicker, and he would also cough up blood, but there was a consideration that the king had issues with his lungs, and that this was the root cause of his demise and death. It was clear to many that the king had consumption, or TB, as it is known today, and Edward VI's limbs swelled up and broke out in sores, and on the 17th of May 1553 he held court with a number of ambassadors, and they later reported on the young boy's sorry state. He was struggling to sleep and was suffering with a very bad demise. He was just a young man, and some people would turn to God and consider that Edward must have committed sin. But he then changed his line of succession, and he made his heir his cousin Lady Jane Grey, who was a prominent Protestant. But the king's last few days were even worse than what he experienced before. His hair began to fall out, and he could no longer stand, only lay down in his bed. But the final public sighting of Edward VI was on the 1st of July 1553, when he was spotted by a crowd standing by a window in the palace. However, on the 6th of July 1553, Edward VI died at 8 o'clock in the evening. He was held by a prominent courtier, Sir Henry Sidney, and Edward's final words were, "I'm faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." But the doctors following his death conducted an autopsy that then cut open his chest and found out that the king had severe lung issues and a very bad lung infection, and that ulcers were found on these vital organs. Following the autopsy, Edward VI's body was embalmed, and his heart and vital organs were removed, and then the cavity of his chest was filled with spices to preserve his body from decay. His body was then buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who took the funeral service. The funeral procession of Edward VI was huge, and the body was taken by barge to Whitehall the night before the funeral ceremony, and his body the next day was then taken to Westminster Abbey. There was a huge amount of ceremony for the boy king. After the funeral had been completed, Edward VI's coffin was then lowered into a white marble vault which had been crafted in front of an altar which had been made for Edward's grandfather, Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. Edward VI's burial vault was not very big at all. The small space measures 2.3 metres long and just 75 centimetres wide, and it was close to the entrance of the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, his grandparents, and also those who founded the Tudor dynasty and brought an end to the Wars of the Roses. Over the centuries there were debates as to move Edward VI's body and to place it in the same vault as Mary I, his half-sister, but this never occurred. But there would be a significant amount of desecration of his vault, as during the English Civil War in 1643, the altar near to his vault was broken up and attacked, and parliamentarians had a habit of ransacking burial vaults and destroying royal tombs. Because of this, the burial vault of Edward VI was then lost for over 200 years. In 1868, parts of the altar that had been smashed up were found, and a new altar was then built, but during this time the coffin of Edward VI was opened, and his vault was also opened. The wooden outer shell of his coffin had at some point been taken away and cleared away, and it was very badly damaged, leading to the conclusion that someone had broken into the vault before, and someone may have robbed the tomb. But witnesses who opened the vault claimed that the lead coffin of the boy king had deformed as well as wasted by long corrosion. With this it meant that the king's remains had been on display for some time, and that through the damage his body could be seen. There were no repairs ever done to give him a new coffin or a better burial, but it was claimed that Edward VI's cerecloth had fallen away and showed that no hair was attached to the skull. Because of this opening, Edward's remains had been decayed heavily, and his remains had become a skeleton. At the time there were other Tudor figures whose burial vaults were opened, and it was seen that they were well preserved, but Edward's was different. Edward's coffin had also been heavily damaged, and obviously had been broken into. There was never a grand tomb and monument created for Edward VI, and today only a small memorial plaque marks the site of his burial. There had been a significant amount of desecration of the Tudor boy king's remains, and over the years his vault had been broken into. He was a great hope that Henry VIII had to become a king who would rule for decades, but Edward VI's death was harrowing, and he suffered a terrible fate in his last few months. King Charles I's execution was a momentous day, and on the day of his execution he was escorted under armed guard from St James's Palace, where he stayed, to the Palace of Whitehall. That evening carpenters had been busy at work creating an execution scaffold for the crowds to see the proceedings, and this was set up outside a window of the banqueting house. This was so big that everyone had a good view from around, and thousands would gather to witness the king losing his head. Charles was let out through a window, and he made a speech which was difficult to hear due to the commotion. He would state that an unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in their government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an uncorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be. His words were ominous, and were those of a man who believed his time on earth was up, but Charles would then give himself over to the executioner at around 2 p.m. He lowered himself onto the executioner's block after saying a prayer, and he signalled to the executioner that he was ready. In one hard blow from the axe, the king's head was taken off, and the crowd that day, it's believed, sighed very loudly, as they were mixed in their feelings about the king's execution. Some rushed to the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood, but the executioner skipped a number of parts, as he did not show the head to the crowd to avoid being identified, and then following this, the remains of the king were collected in a coffin. They were then taken back inside the palace, ready to be prepared for burial. It's believed that the head was then placed back on the body, as a doctor and physician would use thread to tie this back on, and the remains of Charles I were then also embalmed. Following this, his body was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin ready to be buried, but there was a pause in proceedings, as there was a significant worry as to where the king would be buried. The commission established by Parliament to deal with the king's execution and death believed it was too risky for the king to be buried in the middle of central London, and in particular within the confines of Westminster Abbey. Parliament were terrified by retribution following the king's death, and they were worried about royalists rising up to fight back with a purpose and a cause. They were concerned that his burial place would have become a shrine also, and that people would try to dig his remains up. But because of this, the commission then looked for other suitable places to bury a king, and they settled upon Windsor Castle, and in particular St George's Chapel inside of the castle's walls, and this was believed to have been much quieter. Of course, in recent times, Queen Elizabeth II was buried inside of this chapel, and many other kings and queens of England have been laid to rest inside of the royal vault, along with other members of the royal family. But Parliament made the decision to bury the king rather quickly and quietly, and under the cover of darkness. Charles's coffin was taken during the night on the 9th of February 1649, and it was taken on a short journey from central London to Windsor. Moving the king's remains was kept quiet, and it did not attract a huge amount of scandal and controversy. The place specifically where Charles was buried was in the same vault as the notorious Tudor monarch King Henry VIII and his third wife Jane Seymour. This was found in the choir and under the floor, and this was considered a rather secret place. But Charles II, Charles I's son, would dream of building his father a huge mausoleum, but still today under the floor of the chapel, Charles is laid to rest. The burial was seen by a number of the king's former servants, but 200 years after the execution of the king, the coffin of King Charles I would be opened, and it was believed it had been lost to time, but it was found. During 1813 there was building work being carried out inside of the chapel, and because of this builders accidentally broke into the vault, containing the remains of Charles I, Jane Seymour and King Henry VIII, as well as a child of Queen Anne. They noticed that Henry's coffin was broken up and in a bad way, but then the coffin of Charles I was located as it had markings on top of it. It was then decided that the coffin would be opened up, and this was done on the 1st of April 1813 in front of the Prince Regent, the future King George IV. The man who opened the coffin was Sir Henry Halford, and he examined the body of Charles I and broke into the coffin. He saw the king's head and made an image of it, and when he removed the coffin lid, he came across a plain lead coffin with an inscription on it saying King Charles, 1648. He then made an opening in the top part of the coffin lid, and the internal wooden coffin was in a bad state, and the body of Charles I had been prepared in many different ways. It had been wrapped in many layers of cerecloth, and this was prepared with resin, which would preserve the body well. The body was so well wrapped that it was difficult for Halford to take the body out of the coffin and try to unwrap it. It was said of the king's remains that, at length, the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of nose was gone, but the left eye in the first moment of exposure was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval, many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it's almost certain that the facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye, and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen which touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of his head was more of an inch of length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. At some point Halford even held the head up and analysed it, confirming that this was in fact King Charles I without any doubt. He said of this that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surfaces of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could only be produced by a heavy blow, inflicted with a very sharp instrument. This confirmed that Charles I had lost his head by a sharp axe, handled by a skilled executioner. It was then said that, following the examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation, the coffin was soldered up again and the vault closed. But Halford would allegedly steal parts of the remains of the king, and he removed the vertebrae from the king, and he would show this off at dinner parties to his guests. Charles I was a king who would lose his head for being a man who plunged the country into civil war, and he was by all standards a terrible monarch. But his execution was one which scarred a country and a nation, and shocked everyone around the world. But centuries later the king's coffin would be opened, and his remains would be tampered with and disturbed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.